They believed they were clever. They thought they had set the stage, chosen the rules, and decided the outcome. You let them. You didn't resist the setup, didn't expose your awareness. You played along. Every taunt, every manipulation, every half smile they threw your way was recorded in the quiet corners of your mind. They mistook your stillness for submission. But while they were moving recklessly, you were calculating angles. They were loud, you were focused. They were impulsive, you were deliberate. Every time they tried to draw you into chaos, you let them think they succeeded. But what they didn't realize was that every step forward only led them deeper into your design. The game they started was never yours to lose. It was theirs to finish. And when the final move arrived, you didn't need force, you needed timing. The climax wasn't revenge, it was revelation. You didn't destroy them, you made them witness their own undoing. They thought they were playing with emotion, but you were playing with awareness. Their strategy relied on reaction. Yours relied on silence. You studied the rhythm of their deceit like a musician studies melody. You learned how they flattered before they betrayed, how they provoked before they apologized. You saw their entire pattern before they even realized it was visible, so you adapted. You mirrored calm while dismantling their illusion from the inside. They assumed you were unaware, because you never interrupted their act. But you were never their audience, you were the director. You let them perform their role until the moment came when they exposed themselves completely. And when it happened, you didn't celebrate, you simply watched the truth unfold. That's the beauty of understanding human psychology. You never need to fight chaos when you know it destroys itself. They played for attention. You played for peace. And peace always wins in silence. Every manipulator believes they control the script until they meet someone who understands narrative better. You didn't rush to rewrite the story. They handed you the pen by overestimating themselves. You learned that power doesn't come from aggression, but from control of tempo. You slowed everything down until their impulsiveness became obvious. They wanted speed, you chose precision. They wanted drama, you chose detachment. You didn't just win, you dismantled their rhythm. That's what created the climax. They collapsed trying to maintain performance while you stayed still. You taught them that games played in deceit never end with victory. They end with exposure. When the truth surfaced, they didn't fall loudly, they fell inward. You didn't need applause, only closure. They called you ruthless because you refused to entertain chaos. But you weren't cruel, you were clear. You didn't end the game out of spite. You ended it because you had already mastered it. Their downfall began the moment they underestimated your composure. They expected resistance, expected you to break under pressure. They didn't know patience can be deadlier than power. You didn't meet their manipulation with rage. You met it with reason. You didn't fight for dominance. You watched them exhaust themselves. The climax wasn't born from confrontation. It came from their realization that nothing they said could move you anymore. They had built a strategy based on your emotional engagement, and when it disappeared, so did their control. Silence became their punishment, and self-awareness became your crown. That's when they realized the game they created no longer belonged to them. They had spent so long trying to win that they forgot what they were even fighting for. And you standing calm in the aftermath became everything they feared, a reflection of what mastery looks like when emotion bows to logic. They never expected you to outgrow the game itself. They were playing for ego while you were transforming through endurance. What they thought was manipulation was just your lesson in observation. You didn't retaliate because you understood something they never would. People always expose themselves when you give them time. And you gave them time. You didn't need to set traps. You simply waited for their own behavior to do the work. The climax came not from revenge, but from inevitability. You didn't destroy their plans, their character did. Betrayal always circles back to its source, and arrogance always collapses under its own weight. You just watched quietly, detached yet deeply aware, as the mask they wore began to dissolve. The power of restraint lies in understanding that the universe finishes what ego begins. You simply refused to interfere with justice that was already in motion. They had power only when you cared. The moment you withdrew your emotional investment, their control vanished. They didn't realize they were building a house made of reactions, and when you stopped providing them, the foundation crumbled. That was the moment everything shifted. They started the game, but you turned it into revelation. They sought attention, and you turned it into exposure. They thought silence meant surrender, but silence meant dominance. Every manipulator fears what they can't provoke. You gave them what they couldn't comprehend: indifference. They tried to play mind games with someone who had already studied the mind. Their tactics, once sharp, became dull against your awareness. You were no longer trying to fix, forgive, or justify. You were observing the natural consequences of dishonesty. And when they realized that, it wasn't anger they felt, it was humiliation. They weren't losing to you. They were losing to truth. You saw how they operated long before they made their move. They needed validation disguised as control. They wanted to feel clever by making you doubt your intuition. But betrayal taught you not to flinch. You knew how to observe without absorbing, how to notice without reacting. So while they plotted, you listened. While they performed, you studied. And when it was time, you made one move. The kind that doesn't require words, only execution. You didn't argue, didn't defend. You simply let results speak. They had spent months crafting illusions, and you dismantled them with a single decision: to detach. That was your climax. No shouting, no spectacle, just quiet completion. They wanted chaos. You gave them consequence. You let them discover what happens when manipulation meets someone who cannot be controlled. You didn't win the game. They lost the illusion of control. They tried to rewrite the ending, but silence had already sealed it. You didn't need to justify why you walked away. Your peace was explanation enough. They tried to reach out, not from remorse, but from fear of irrelevance. They could feel the difference in your tone, the calm that comes from detachment. They could hear it in your absence, the sound of someone who no longer plays. They were used to emotional fireworks. Now they were left in darkness. That's the climax no manipulator prepares for. The moment the other player stops playing. You didn't expose them publicly. You didn't humiliate them. You simply let truth make its own noise, and the silence that followed wasn't emptiness. It was victory. The kind that doesn't need validation because it's already absolute. When everything was over, they tried to pretend it didn't affect them. They laughed too loudly, acted unbothered, exaggerated normalcy. But you knew better. You had seen behind that mask before, and you recognized the cracks now widening beneath the surface. The performance had lost its rhythm because you were no longer part of it. You had been the mirror reflecting their illusion, and now, without you, their reflection was gone. That's why they keep mentioning you indirectly, trying to stay relevant in the story they no longer control. You live rent-free in their silence. They can't erase what they learned. The awareness of being outplayed by someone who never bragged, never gloated, never needed to. That's the kind of climax that lingers. It doesn't explode, it echoes. They were used to noise, used to people begging, pleading, explaining, reacting. They built their confidence on chaos because it made them feel powerful. Every raised voice, every emotional spiral gave them proof that they mattered. Then you appeared, collected, unrateable. They tried to pull you into their storm, but you refused to move. Your silence didn't come from fear, it came from mastery. You showed them what composure can do in a world addicted to control. You didn't need to manipulate because you had learned how to manage yourself. They couldn't understand it at first. They mistook your peace for pride. But soon, they realized control loses meaning when it meets someone who no longer reacts. Your composure exposed their addiction to dominance. They needed to feel in charge, but you didn't need to feel anything. That imbalance destroyed them more than confrontation ever could. You became untouchable by doing nothing except staying centered. You didn't have to prove power, you embodied it. Composure became your shield, your strategy, your rebellion. They were loud, but loudness means nothing when met with stillness that doesn't break. You watched their outbursts from a distance, not because you were detached, but because you refused to let them rewrite your energy. They threw insults, made accusations, tried to get a rise out of you. You didn't give it. That was the moment they started losing control. Because those who depend on manipulation can't survive without reaction. You taught them the difference between control and composure. Control dominates others, composure governs self. You no longer cared about proving innocence, defending worth, or earning understanding. You simply existed in peace, and that alone became power. In a world that glorifies dominance, you became something rarer, disciplined. And discipline terrifies those who only know chaos. They saw what true restraint looks like and mistook it for magic. Your calmness exposed their instability. Every time they tried to provoke you, they ended up revealing more about themselves. Their tactics, once effective, began to sound desperate. They couldn't manipulate someone who wasn't performing for approval anymore. You used to chase closure. Now you gave it to yourself. They felt it. The shift in your tone. The quiet certainty in your eyes. You were no longer explaining your peace. You were living it. They could sense that nothing they did could reach you anymore. That realization broke them in silence. Because control only exists when the other side participates. When you stopped reacting, they stopped existing in the role they built for themselves. You didn't even have to expose them. They exposed their own dependence. That's the power of composure. It doesn't confront chaos. It reflects it until the truth becomes undeniable. You became the mirror they couldn't bear to look into anymore. They believed control meant dominance, but they never understood that true power is invisible. You didn't command the room, you recalibrated it. Your presence alone began to shift energy because composure holds a vibration chaos can't touch. You stopped moving with emotion and started moving with intention. They mocked your calm at first, calling it coldness, detachment, arrogance. But deep down they envied it. They wanted your self-control, but not your discipline. They wanted your clarity, but not your solitude. Because composure is built in silence. Where chaos fears to go, you learned to separate noise from necessity. You spoke only when words carried precision. You acted only when action held purpose. They couldn't compete with that, because their confidence came from impulse, not awareness. You showed them that power doesn't roar, it resonates. The louder they got, the smaller they felt beside your quiet certainty. You became proof that stillness, when mastered, commands everything noise cannot. They wanted to dominate your mind, to twist perception until you doubted yourself. But composure turned doubt into data. You didn't collapse under pressure, you studied it. Every insult became a clue. Every manipulation became a pattern. They thought silence meant defeat, but it was documentation. You were watching, learning, adjusting. Your calm was not passive, it was preparation. You learned that composure doesn't ignore emotion, it manages it. You let anger cool into clarity, pain harden into purpose, and disappointment sharpen into wisdom. You became your own anchor. They depended on reaction, but you became rhythm itself. They couldn't shake what refused to move. You didn't play defense anymore, you played alignment. That's what separates chaos from mastery. They fought to win arguments, you focused on winning peace. And the cruel irony was that peace is the one thing control can't compete with. Composure became your language when words lost meaning. You learned to speak through presence, through timing, through energy. They couldn't read it because they were fluent only in manipulation. Every sentence they spoke was designed to provoke, to pull you off balance. You didn't take the bait. You let silence translate for you. That silence wasn't absence, it was awareness. It made them uncomfortable because it reminded them of the truth they avoided. People addicted to control despise calm souls because calmness cannot be controlled. They wanted to predict your next move, but you stopped moving to their rhythm. You didn't fight back. You outgrew the fight entirely. You walked differently, stood differently, spoke differently. Every gesture said what words could not, that you no longer played by their rules. And in that stillness, they realized their biggest fear. You weren't under control, you were in command. They didn't know composure could dismantle power so effortlessly. They relied on chaos as their weapon, but you turned detachment into armor. Every attempt they made to provoke you became proof of their own weakness. You no longer looked at them with anger, you looked through them with understanding. That's what unnerved them most. You understood too much. You saw their need for control came from insecurity, not intelligence. You recognized their aggression as fear disguised as dominance. Composure lets you see what ego tries to hide. You no longer fought them. You studied them until they became predictable. And once someone becomes predictable, they lose all leverage. You let them reveal themselves completely before removing your energy altogether. That was your final move, subtle, silent, complete. You didn't destroy their power. You made it irrelevant. You proved that control collapses the moment it meets someone who no longer plays emotional chess. They called your calm strange. They couldn't understand how you could be betrayed, lied to, disrespected, and still remain unshaken. They wanted reaction because reaction meant they still mattered. But you learned that peace doesn't need to prove itself. You didn't suppress emotion. You simply refused to let it dictate behavior. That is what real strength looks like. Feeling everything and still choosing restraint. Your composure was misunderstood as indifference, but it was awareness disguised as quiet. They used to think chaos equaled power. Now they see composure creates it. You don't need to raise your voice when your energy already commands attention. You don't need to prove your point when the truth lives in your demeanor. The calm you carry now is your signature. It tells every manipulator you've met their kind before, and that you no longer bleed for lessons already learned. There's a kind of elegance in refusing to participate in dysfunction. You didn't resist their control. You outgrew it. You learned that chaos only wins when you respond emotionally. You stopped feeding it, and it starved. Your composure was the slowest form of justice. Quiet, deliberate, and irreversible. They didn't just lose control, they lost identity. Their confidence was built on reaction, and your peace dismantled it molecule by molecule. That's the danger of composure. It doesn't destroy loudly. It dissolves everything quietly. They will remember the look in your eyes, that stillness that carried both forgiveness and finality. Because composure doesn't come from arrogance. It comes from awakening. You woke up to the truth that control is for those who haven't mastered themselves. You became proof that restraint isn't weakness, it's evolution. And evolution always makes the old game obsolete. You didn't have to expose them. They exposed themselves the moment you stopped reacting. That's the quiet brilliance of composure. It pulls truth out like gravity, slow and inescapable. When you stayed calm, the cracks in their facade began to widen. They tried to keep the mask on, to pretend they still held control. But calmness has a way of disarming deceit. They could feel your energy shift, the kind of stillness that doesn't seek validation or vengeance. You didn't accuse. You observed. You didn't chase truth. You attracted it. Lies can only exist in noise, and you removed the noise completely. Every truth they buried started to rise on its own, pulled up by the pressure of your peace. You didn't fight them for the truth. They fought themselves trying to hide it. Composure doesn't demand honesty. It makes dishonesty collapse under its own weight. And when it did, you didn't say a word. You just watched it fall. They wanted chaos to distract you from their inconsistency. But chaos has no power over someone who has mastered silence. You knew all along that time reveals everything. You didn't need confrontation, just patience. While they were scrambling to protect their lies, you stood still, anchored in awareness. That unshaken energy became unbearable to them. They felt seen, not because you said anything, but because you didn't flinch. That's what composure does. It holds a mirror up to guilt without moving a muscle. It forces people to face themselves in the reflection they once mocked. You didn't drag the truth out of them. It surfaced naturally because lies can't breathe in calm air. They need reaction, heat, friction. You offered none. You let their deception choke itself out. The more still you became, the more their performance unraveled. That's when they realized truth doesn't always arrive with thunder. It often enters quietly, carried by calm. There's a psychological art to composure. People underestimate its impact because it doesn't roar. It radiates. When you remain still in the face of manipulation, your energy becomes a magnet for exposure. Those who lied start to slip, not because you interrogate them, but because they can't hold eye contact with calm. Stillness becomes too heavy for the dishonest to bear. They begin to over-explain, to fill silence with justification, to twist narratives that no one asked for. And you say nothing, because you know the truth always reveals itself when patience refuses to panic. Composure works like gravity. It doesn't chase what belongs to it, it simply draws it closer. You didn't beg for honesty. You created an atmosphere where lies couldn't survive. Their guilt floated to the surface because your peace made their chaos visible. And once truth appears in light that calm, it can never be hidden again. They confused calmness with indifference, but indifference carries no weight. Your composure, however, carried consequence. It made their actions echo louder than your words ever could. They tried to provoke you, to pull emotion from you, to make you break your balance. But you held firm, and that stillness became unbearable because it left them alone with their truth. Most people hide behind reaction. They use others' emotions as a distraction from their own guilt. You didn't give them that escape. They were forced to sit with what they'd done, while you stood silently nearby, unbothered, unmoved, unbroken. That's when their confidence began to decay. They realized they couldn't control the outcome anymore because you no longer participated in their performance. Truth doesn't need force, it only needs space. You gave it space, and it rose like smoke from the fire they started. They wanted you loud. You became untouchable through quiet. You learned something sacred about human nature through that process. Truth reveals itself when calmness refuses to compete. They built their entire strategy on controlling narrative, twisting perception, playing the victim. But composure breaks manipulation because it doesn't engage the story, it watches it. You watch their movements, their tone, their contradictions. You noticed how they smiled too easily after cruelty, how their words never matched their energy. Every small inconsistency became evidence, not through confrontation, but through contrast. Your steadiness became the spotlight that revealed everything false. They didn't understand how they were unraveling so fast when you hadn't done anything. But that's the secret, you didn't need to. You became gravity, and gravity never fights, it simply pulls. Every lie, every act, every secret they buried began to drift upward because your peace refused to cover it. Composure doesn't expose. It invites the truth to expose itself. They said you were emotionless, that you didn't care. But they mistook depth for distance. You cared enough to protect your energy from being poisoned. That's what composure is. Guarded awareness, not apathy. You had seen what reaction does. It feeds manipulation. It validates deceit. So you starved it. You learned that real strength isn't loud, it's contained. You became untouchable, not because you fought, but because you refused to lose yourself again. They couldn't stand that your silence didn't plead or prove. It just existed, powerful and pure. And slowly, truth started showing up without you needing to demand it. People who once doubted you began to notice the pattern. Time started aligning the pieces exactly as you foresaw. That's what composure does. It collaborates with time. Together they reveal what chaos hides. And when truth finally surfaced, everyone could see it clearly. You didn't need to announce victory. It was already written in how calm you stayed. Composure creates discomfort because it removes excuses. They could no longer blame emotion, misunderstanding, or circumstance. The calm you carried forced accountability. They had to sit with their choices, stripped of the noise they once used to justify themselves. That's the silent justice of composure. It doesn't humiliate, it clarifies. You didn't want revenge, you wanted truth. And truth came quietly, as it always does. They started to break under the simplicity of your restraint. You didn't curse them, didn't try to explain, didn't fight for closure. You just stood there, grounded. That stillness made them confront what they'd been avoiding. And when their words finally failed them, when the silence became unbearable, you understood why composure is feared. It doesn't argue, it doesn't warn. It exposes. You don't have to seek truth when you are calm enough for it to find you. They learned that the hard way. Every manipulator fears calm people because calm people see. You can't deceive what doesn't rush to react. You waited long enough for patterns to show themselves. And they did. Every inconsistency, every false smile, every story told twice with a new detail. You didn't accuse, you remembered. You didn't punish, you outlasted. Composure has that effect. It outlasts lies, outlasts performance, outlasts guilt. You stayed grounded while they tangled themselves in their own contradictions. By the time truth surfaced, you didn't need to defend your name. It defended itself. They realized you had been right all along. but too late to undo the damage. That's how composure wins. It doesn't demand correction, it lets exposure arrive naturally. You didn't fight for vindication because you trusted something stronger. Truth gravitates towards stillness, and you were the stillest thing in their world of panic. They'll always remember how your calm felt. Not cold, but impossible to move. It haunted them. It made them feel transparent. Because composure doesn't just reveal truth. It amplifies it. Every lie sounds louder against silence. Every act of deceit becomes clearer when it meets stillness. They couldn't handle it. You were no longer the person they could manipulate with emotion, and that realization stripped their control completely.